Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our Time to Act Mental Health Echo. If you've not done so, if you'll take a minute and put your name and contact information into the chat, it is just another way to get to know everybody on the call, who's on there. So if somebody says something and you want to reach out to them, you know how to do that. We are recording today's session. These are always stored on our Canvas pages as well as our YouTube channel. We use those for educational purposes and quality improvement. You are always more than welcome to go back and review today's session, share it with colleagues, and utilize it that way. Echo is a very interactive community, so put your comments into chat. Come off mute if you have any questions. Kurt and all of our amazing hub members that have an asterisk in front of their name or will now have an asterisk in front of their name will be more than happy to answer any of your questions and help monitor that chat for us. We also do case narratives, and they are a great way to gather information about tough cases that you're working with, or you're just not quite sure what to do with a family or a client that you're working with. All these amazing people on the call will generate recommendations. And so if you're interested or willing or wanting, please reach out to us and consider doing a case narrative. We do talk about sensitive information, and we all know the HIPAA and FERPA world, so just please remember to protect the individual privacy, try to de-identify those situations. Again, if you've never been to an echo session, welcome to your first one. These are amazing portions. They're a great way to increase professional development, but we will always have a didactic speaker. We always have a case presentation and feedback, and then we are really looking to build just that professional network. So sharing and knowing each other who is on the call. If you can take a minute and rename your profile, the next couple of slides are pretty a review. We've all been on Zoom for so many years now. It seems like it's just part of our everyday world. But rename your profile, raising your hand if you have any questions, or drop it into chat. Again, always pre-register. We try to share information in advance. We also send out reminders, information about all of our echo sessions that we have here at the Institute. We do send out a credit of attendance after the survey has been completed. That's our incentive to get our surveys done. We'll be dropping in the survey link throughout today's session. It will also come in the email after today's session. We store everything on Canvas. So if you do not have a Canvas invite, please reach out to time2actaggies@usu.edu and we will get you connected to our Canvas page. Another plug for case studies. Those are always the best way to get information and recommendations on cases that you're working on. We do have social media pages. If you want to take a minute and follow us on any of those social media pages, we share information that we get from presenters, from other participants on the call, anything that is going on around the echo sessions that we do. I am going to stop my sharing and turn the time over to the amazing Dr. Matt Wappett. He is going to be doing our session today.
So hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk. I'm going to kind of jump in on a topic today that I'm not sure if it was originally on your schedule, but it's what we're going to talk about today, which is masculinity and mental health, which is a topic that I have kind of been focusing on over the last couple of years, and have found, it's important to have some of these discussions. I do at the beginning here want to kind of give you a quick trigger warning. I will be discussing sensitive topics. I will be sharing some personal experiences, but I also will be discussing suicide, mental health, violence, those sort of things. So just putting that out there so that if those are of particular concern to you, you can, just be aware that they will come up throughout here. With that said, I'll do a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me, but I'm going to fly through this relatively quickly. I am the director of the Utah State University Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice. I also have a faculty appointment in special education and rehabilitation counseling here in the College of Education and Human Services. I started my mental health journey over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, with some postdoctoral training I did at Harvard Medical School on mind-body medicine. I also serve as the editor-in-chief for the Developmental Disabilities Network Journal. So none of those have a lot to do with mental health. It really hasn't been a lot of focus on mental health outside of my personal experience, except for the last few years. And I was one of the principal investigators on the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center. I'm a founding board member of the Mental Health and IDD, or Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities National Research Consortium at Johns Hopkins University, that provides funding and research around mental health for people with disabilities. And then I continue to work with the White House Task Force on Mental Health, Homelessness, and Substance Abuse. So although my background is in special education and inclusion, a lot of my work over the past 10 years has moved more and more towards mental health. So with that said, I'm also a fully formed human being. I'm a river rat and spend a lot of time in the summer on the rivers here in the West, in Utah and Idaho, Montana, Washington. And so that will come into play here too. I bring that up also because it's important to note that the culture that I was raised in was a culture that gave me unrealistic expectations of masculinity. And I grew up in a very traditional male patriarchal culture, which has resulted in some of my awareness of the issues that we're going to discuss today. So with that said, I'm going to start with a personal story here. This is me and my daughter, and I coached her hockey team for over 7 years. And I grew up playing hockey. Like I said, I grew up in Alaska. Well, I didn't say that, but I am saying that now. I grew up in Alaska. I grew up in a very traditional household. I grew up in a culture where I was an athlete. I played hockey in high school. I skied in high school. There were certain behaviors I was expected to conform to, and those behaviors have shaped a lot of my life. It wasn't until 2009 that I actually really became aware of my mental health. So on June 24th, 2009, I was sitting in my kitchen in Moscow, Idaho, and our house in Moscow was just down the hill from the fire station. And I was eating breakfast, and that morning the fire truck came out of the station and rushed down the street. And I remember sitting there and thinking, somebody's going to have a really bad day. And so I finished my breakfast, didn't think again about it, went out, got on my bike, and I rode my bike to work those days. And as I was riding my bike, I saw all this smoke coming from a neighborhood just about a mile away from our house. I got to my office and received a phone call. And at this point in time, I was the chair of a school board there in Moscow, the Moscow Charter School, the oldest charter school in Idaho. And we had lost our administrator. I was the de facto administrator while our new administrator was moving to Idaho from Tennessee. The school year had just finished that first week of June. Teachers were packing up and getting out their stuff. We were doing the final reporting for the charter school. And so I was very much involved with this little local school. So I get to my office and I receive a phone call from the police, and the police told me I needed to get over to the charter school immediately. I went over to the charter school and was confronted by a media frenzy, fire trucks, police, ambulances. And it turns out that our third grade teacher at Moscow Charter School had been murdered by her husband. Now, to make things even more complicated, I worked with the mother of the murderer. And so I was caught in a very interesting situation. On the one hand, I was managing a crisis response by the community to the murder of this third grade teacher who happened to be 8 months pregnant. The murderer had killed her and had set the house on fire to try to cover up the tracks and then had run off. So I ended up managing a huge investigation. The school was involved, parents and students were concerned. They were reaching out to me, media organizations from across the West, all the way from Seattle and Spokane in California were coming out to cover this story, and I was the media liaison. And at the same time, I had the distraught mother of the murderer, who was the accountant at my other job, who was sharing with me her struggles on the other side. And I very quickly broke down under that pressure. I'll just be honest, and I'm not going to share all the details, but I very quickly broke down under that pressure and found that I did not have the skills to cope with all of the stress that I had. And I found myself getting angry, and I found myself turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms, drinking, substances. And that raised quite a few red flags for me, and I recognized that I needed to do something. So it was actually at this point in time, later in 2010, early 2010, when I took a sabbatical from work and went to Harvard Medical School, primarily for me to study mind-body medicine and to study mental health, primarily to help myself. But through that process, I learned a lot about the importance of mental health and really how unrealistic the expectations are for males that we put up within our culture and some of the barriers that we struggle with. At the same time as I was discovering my deficit in managing mental health, I was also discovering family secrets. I discovered that my grandfather, who was a cowboy from Idaho Falls, he owned a large cattle herd in Idaho Falls, grew up herding sheep, moved into cattle, was very much an independent Western maverick, also struggled with substance abuse. He died as a result of an opioid overdose. But this was something the family didn't talk about until I started talking about my struggles. And all of a sudden I discover, yeah, grandpa had issues. Oh, and his father had issues. And all of a sudden I recognized that these patterns that I was seeing in myself, these unhealthy coping mechanisms, these challenges that I was facing were something that the rest of my family had faced for generations. And yet nobody had talked about it. Nobody had mentioned it. It was unspoken, and it was just assumed that we were going to manage and somehow make it. Now, this is not atypical, especially here in the West. So we need to talk about males' mental health. If we look across the world and across all demographic segments, men are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness and emotional isolation that's exacting a terrible toll. If we look just here in the United States, according to the Centers for Disease Control, approximately 121 Americans die by suicide each day. 93 of them are men. That's approximately 75% of the people who are dying by suicide. And the age group of males from 45 to 64 is the fastest growing demographic. Now, when we look at and break that down across population groups, and we look at sort of that death rate by suicide, it's double for men among the Asian and Pacific Islanders compared to women population, and it's triple among the population of white, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian Alaska Native groups than it is for women. And there's lots of reasons for this. The big one is that men tend to have more access to firearms, and firearms end up being the most common way that men choose to commit suicide, and that's one that has unfortunately, it's not a nice term to consider, but a higher success rate than other forms of suicide. But the fact is that men are struggling. And a lot of that is because of our culture. So if we look at the West here, if we break this down and we look at the mountain time zone and then Alaska, rates of suicide by males in Montana, Alaska, and Wyoming are roughly double the national rate. And New Mexico, Idaho, and Utah are just under that rate. So we're right up there. Now, the interesting thing is that these are the states with a strong Western identity. Think about Yellowstone, right? The cable show that's on now, and the sort of portrayal of cowboys and these independent Westerners who are out forging their way in the right on the frontier. We have this really strong independent Western identity that we've absorbed in these intermountain states. But these are the states where men are most clearly struggling with managing their mental and emotional health. If we kind of break down this suicide trend across like other demographic groups, we find that it's much, much higher among veterans, farmers and ranchers who live in rural areas. We find it's high in industries like mining and construction. And so the question is, what do all these groups have in common? Well, these are sort of stereotypical male groups, right? You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to be strong. There's potentially violence, hard work, that are kind of they're these independent, macho sort of careers. And that's really the identity that a lot of males in the West are taught to absorb. Now, that's not just in the US. That actually goes across the Americas. And in 2019, the World Health Organization did a huge report on male mental health. And one of the things that they highlighted in this report was that 1 in 5 men will not reach the age of 50 in the Americas, so that's North America and South America, due to issues relating to toxic masculinity. And I'll define toxic masculinity here in a bit, but a big part of toxic masculinity are these macho stereotypes that we have around how a male should behave. So according to the World Health Organization, the gender roles and norms and practices that are socially imposed on men in the Americas reinforce a lack of self-care and neglect of their own physical and mental health. You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to suck it up. You're supposed to ignore your feelings, and you're supposed to get on and do what you're supposed to do. This is actually called machismo. And that term is the same in Spanish and in English, but it's a historically constructed hegemonic form of socialization called machismo. It's been dominant in the United States and in South America since the mid-1800s. And it's a big part of our culture that is largely invisible to many of us because we just assume that that is the way that it is. Now, there are incredible public health implications when we look at this concept of machismo. This traditional concept of masculinity, when we break it down, results not just in risks to men, but it also results in risks to women and children in the form of violence, domestic violence, and otherwise, sexually transmitted infections, and a lack of shared responsibility in the home. So it's not just affecting men, it's also affecting their partners, their spouses, their families, who they live with. It leads to risk to other men through accidents, homicides, and other violence, because oftentimes men don't have the tools to manage their emotional well-being, and as a result, they lash out with violence and anger. And then again, it results in risk to self, such as suicide, accidents, alcoholism, and other addictions, because men often don't have the tools to manage their emotional lives. They feel like they get stuck, and they resort to other, and in many cases, easier ways to manage it that often result in detrimental outcomes. Now, we could also think of this concept of machismo as the man box. And so this term, the man box, comes from a 2017 study that really looked at the economic impact of harmful masculine stereotypes. And this was done by a research consortium that included corporate research organizations and also universities. And anyway, I'll send this slide to Janelle and she can send it out. The 2017 study, it's linked there. So if you want to link to it and read the whole 100 and something page report, you're more than welcome to. It's very interesting. But what this 2017 global study found was that a belief in these traditional male stereotypes was linked with increased violence and a higher risk of suicide. And so researchers started to refer to men who were stuck within these traditional roles, traditional stereotypes, as being trapped in the man box. And what the man box is that limited range of acceptable emotions, experience, and language that men are allowed to display and use if they want to retain their status as a man. Now, men can display behaviors that don't fall outside of that man box, but if they do, there are often repercussions, social repercussions, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. But this man box is actually something that we can measure. The clinicians who worked on this study actually developed a questionnaire, and it was about a 40-item questionnaire to really see to what extent was a male's mental health shaped by this man box that they were stuck in. And after administering this questionnaire thousands of times, what they found was that there were 5 questions on it that most effectively determined whether a man was going to struggle with these limited set of responses that they would have absorbed through the man box. So anyway, those 5 questions with the strongest correlation with violence and poor mental health are: number 1, a man shouldn't have to do household chores. And so when they give this questionnaire to men just rank on it, right? On a scale of 1 to 5. To what extent do you believe this or not believe this? And so number 1, a man shouldn't have to do household chores. Number 2, men should use violence to get respect if necessary. Number 3, a real man should have as many sexual partners as he can. Number 4, a man who talks about his worries, fears, and problems shouldn't really get respect. And then number 5, a gay guy is not a real man. So those 5 items from this longer set of questionnaires have the highest correlation with violence and poor mental health in men, which means that when you look at this, if somebody answers yes to all of these, right, it means that they're going to have a much, much higher likelihood of struggling with their mental health than somebody who does not. So the interesting thing is that we can actually measure this. And it's actually the tool, when I send this out, you can go to that study, you can download the tool, you can use it. It's especially if you're a male, it's a very interesting thing to go through and to look at where have you absorbed these behaviors. But what we find is that men who don't fit in this man box, they struggle, or the men who are trapped in the man box struggle with depression and other mental health issues. But if they work outside of that, if they show emotion, if they cry, if they talk about their feelings, they're often referred to as weak, as being soft. And again, I'm using language here that's not ideal, I know, but this is language that's used frequently among males, referred to as a pussy or gay or not a real man. And this does not just happen within cultural groups that adhere to traditional patriarchal value systems. The research has shown that these messages are also transmitted in single parent households. And the way this looks in a single parent household is, let's say there's a single mother. A single mother has a male child, and that single mother says, well, you need to be the man of the house. You need to do these things to be the man because your father is not here. And so it's reinforced there. It's reinforced in same-sex households. And when we look at that, it's same-sex couples trying to train their children to kind of fit in normal society. And so they reinforce these traditional stereotypes. But then gangs, homeless youth, other social groups also reinforce these stereotypes that there's this limited set of behaviors that a man can resort to if he is struggling with his emotional or mental health. Now, there are some incredible implications of being trapped in the man box. Men who've been raised to believe in these harmful masculine stereotypes are limited in their ability to understand and interact with the full range of human emotions. Therefore, they tend to get frustrated with others who talk about their feelings. They tend to avoid conversations about feelings and emotions. To a certain extent, they're controlled by culture, right? Because they haven't been given the language, the tools, or the space that they need to exert control over their emotional experience. They're literally trapped with, instead of having a Swiss Army knife with multiple tools at their disposal to help manage their mental health, they're stuck with one of those little buck knives I got when I was a Cub Scout with two blades, right? Neither one of them is very sharp. That's kind of what men have been given in most cases in our society to manage their mental health. And the trick is to figure out how to give men more tools to manage their mental health and to break out of this man box that many are trapped in. So what does the man box look like? And what are the implications of it? Well, I'm going to tell you two stories. Both of them happened here in Cache Valley. The first story is about my friend Billy. When I moved here to Cache Valley in 2017, I started to play hockey, and I played on an adult league team. And I very quickly, when I'd go to the ice rink, noticed there was a guy who was always hanging around there. His name was Billy. Billy had been incarcerated. He'd been in prison. He'd had a rough life. He'd struggled with substance abuse, and yet he was trying to get his life together. And hockey was Billy's lifeline. So Billy was there at the rink all the time. Billy played goalie. And adult league teams, there's not a lot of goalies. And so Billy would hang out at the rink, and he would oftentimes play 3 or 4 games a day as a goalie because he loved it. It kept him busy. It was socialization. He was fun to be with in the locker room. Everybody loved Billy. He was incredible. Even my son, who would come and watch the game sometimes, met Billy and loved Billy and thought that he was just a riot. He was a really, really good guy. Well, in 2019, when I was driving down to Provo with my daughter, she had a hockey game down in Provo, and I got a call from the captain of our adult league team. This was in February 2019. And he told me that Billy that morning had committed suicide. Now, we had just seen Billy a couple times the prior week. We had talked with him. He was in the locker room with us. He was funny. He was laughing. There was no indication that he was struggling with anything. And yet clearly, even though we all knew Billy, we all accepted him, he didn't feel comfortable sharing what he was going through, and ended up feeling stuck and feeling like the only way out of whatever it was he was dealing with was to end his life. And I remember that it hit me like a rock. And I remember I couldn't talk the rest of the day. It was shocking. Later that year, my son, who was going to Logan High School, had a friend named Darby. And my son's friend was, again, kind of a punk, as my son is, kind of, a little bit. You can imagine a 16-year-old kid. They're problematic. They're stretching their wings. They're trying to figure out where their place is in the world. They like to skateboard together. They like to goof off. They like to play Dungeons and Dragons. He was my son's lab partner in chemistry. But Darby would disappear frequently, and he wouldn't come to school for long periods of time, and he would isolate himself. And one day, my son got a phone call from the school to let him know that Darby had an argument that morning with his father. And following that argument, he'd gone out to his father's car where his father had a gun. He had taken the gun, he had locked himself in the bathroom, and he had killed himself because, again, he felt trapped. He didn't know how to talk about the emotions he was feeling. He did not feel like he had support. He didn't feel like he had anybody to reach out to. And the only method that was available to him, given the limited range of skills that he had, was unfortunately to end his life. These are just two stories of thousands that happened every year to men who have not been given the tools that they need to manage their mental health. Now, my intent is not to depress you, but it is to illustrate several important lessons. And again, I'm speaking from my personal experience because I've gone through this, but I want you to try to generalize this also to the men that you work with. Number one, and I think this is true for a lot of men, I was not taught about mental health in school, not by my family, not even as an adult. So I didn't have the language to understand the emotions and the struggles and the depression that I was going through when I was in the middle of it. Number two, I was held to an unrealistic expectation of who I should be and how I should behave. It's very difficult to ignore emotions and to push them down and to not pretend that some of these things that we experience as a part of life take a toll on us physically, mentally, and emotionally. And toughing it up and sucking it up is not a great way to manage those. It's actually completely unrealistic. The other thing I've learned, and if we look at the research on this, our increasingly on life has resulted in more isolation and loneliness than most people recognize. In fact, a couple of years ago, the Surgeon General of the United States put out a statement that said that loneliness was the number one public health threat here in the United States for children. And as we've moved more and more online, and COVID has only exacerbated this, we've lost those social connections, those social support systems that we need in order to manage our mental health and our emotional life. And as a result, people feel trapped, they feel alone, and they don't know where to go. And this is especially true for men. And then finally, mental health, unlike physical health, affects everyone within your sphere of influence. It's not an individual phenomenon. The fact that I was struggling with my mental health was one thing, but it was also affecting my family. It was affecting my friends. It was affecting my work. And so mental health for an individual is like a drop within a pond. Yes, at the center of that is where the waves are the biggest, but those ripples go out and they spread throughout workplaces, families, neighborhoods, communities, church congregations. And as a result, addressing mental health is not just about managing an individual's wellness, it's also about managing the wellness of a group and the wellness of our society. So with that said, what do we do? What is the root of the problem? Why is this the way things are? Well, I'm going to go back all the way to the Bible. And that's an odd choice, I know, for some people. But in the Bible, there's a very interesting statement at the very beginning of the Gospel of John in the New Testament. And in the Gospel of John, in that very first verse, it says, "In the beginning, there was the Word." Right? And John goes on to talk about the creation of the world through the Word. Now, John's using the word to mean God, right? And God created the world. But the interesting thing is that this is also a metaphor for the way that we create our world. We create our world, our knowledge, our understanding through language, through the words that we use. Language, words, help us organize our thoughts, make meaning, make connections, and things that we can talk about, things that we can think about using language. And again, thought is very much tied with language, allows us to control our world. And if we can talk about something, we can often control that thing. This is actually why talk therapy works. It's because if we can talk about something, all of a sudden we're able to take that phenomenon and we're able to treat it as something external to ourselves, and we're able to look at it in a more objective light. So when I talk about depression, if I talk about my depression, that's fine, but it's allowing me to see my depression as separate from me. And I can talk about how I'm feeling, and I can talk about the effects it's having on me, and I can talk about what causes this, and I can talk about what helps me feel better. And by doing that, it gives me control over the emotions that are going through my body. And this works for everybody. If we can talk about it, we can work with it. If we don't talk about it, then we can't address the problem. We need to have language out there so that we can speak about these phenomena. And unfortunately, men have oftentimes not been given the language that they need to talk about their emotional life. Now, any of you who hang out with males or have young boys may notice this, and I would encourage you to do this. So, and again, and this has been replicated over and over and over again through research. Take a group of, let's say, 8 to 10-year-old males and put them together. Listen to their conversation, and then take a group of 8 to 10-year-old females and listen to their conversation. 8 to 10-year-old males tend to talk about, right, sports and competition. And there's, and I think about my son, right? There's a lot of bro and dude, and there's pushing and shoving and physicality and and a lot of competition there. And then when I listen to my 2 girls with their friends, especially when they were younger, there was a lot of talk about feelings, and this is how I feel, and I wonder if this person likes me, and if they don't like me. In many cases, women have been given more language to address their emotional life, and they have more of a toolbox in order to understand those emotions, whereas men, it has not been something that we've been good at giving them, and as a result, they don't have it. But if we can give them that tool, then they can exercise control over their mental health. Now, the question is, what can we do then as men, but also as allies? Well, I think there's a few recommendations that have been shown to be relatively effective. Number one is that men have to own their mental health, and they have to be willing to talk about it. We need practice, and men learn by observing. It's important that men hear other men talk about their mental health. This is something that I have really tried to do quite a bit here at work, but also at home with my kids, is talk about mental health, how I'm feeling, how it affects me, because what that does is it shows my son that it's okay to feel these things. And it also gives him the language to talk about it when he's going through difficult times. But the same thing with coworkers and colleagues and others. It's very, very important that people see that it's okay to talk about these things. We need to be able to talk about mental health the same way we talk about high blood pressure or heart attacks or athletic injuries. For males, oftentimes it's cool to come in and say, I hurt myself out skiing, or I crashed on my bike, or, oh, I was out, working hard and had a heart attack or whatever, right? Those are things that we're not going to hide. And yet we're a lot more reticent to talk about our mental health. And yet it would be much, much more helpful if we created a space where it was okay to come in and say, you know what? I'm feeling really anxious about today, or I'm depressed about this thing that happened yesterday. If we could talk that way and share those emotions, again, it gives us control over them. And we need to talk about these things with not just other men, but with our kids, our colleagues. We need to normalize this so that others feel comfortable talking about it and asking for help as well. We also, as men, and I know this is a hard one, is we need to be willing to ask for help, even though we may not want to. And I don't want to go to the stereotype, but it's a stereotype I grew up with. I remember all the fights when we'd go on trips with my family and my dad. All the fights broke out because my dad refused to ask for help, for directions. And I remember just massive fights and sitting in parking lots with my mom, angry at my dad because he refused to ask directions. I inherited that, and I've had quite a few fights with my spouse by my stubbornness not to ask directions. But directions are low stakes. It becomes much higher stakes when we're talking about our mental and emotional health. And men have to be willing to ask for help, and it needs to be normalized to ask for help. I will tell you that the number one thing that has helped me manage my mental health is finding a therapist that I can work with, somebody who I can meet with monthly to talk about what's going on in my life. And that has made all the difference in exercising control over the mental health issues that I struggle with. So, what can men do for their own mental health? Well, so socially we can talk about it and men can talk about it, but there are other things that make men unique. Now, I do want to point out here at towards the end that men are different. And I know that sounds stupid. I was actually just reading a book and an article about this, about male mental health. And there's a big debate, right? The American Psychological Association here in the United States put out a statement back in 2019 saying that male gender roles are largely through culture. And the British Psychological Association actually put out a challenge to that and said, well, yes, a lot of it comes through culture, but there are some fundamental differences in males, right? Males have higher testosterone. Males have a different physiological makeup. And as a result, there are some just built-in natural things within the male physical body that make it more responsive to certain interventions than others. And so it's important to recognize those differences and recognize that there are things that a male can do that will be more beneficial than maybe a female or somebody else. But if we look at what men can do for their own mental health, number one, I think it's important that men learn about the mind-body connection and how stress and emotions impact your body. And men tend to like to know why. Why do I need to focus on this? Why should I learn about this? Why is this important? And so helping men understand why it's important is a beginning point. Number two is getting men to stop unhealthy coping mechanisms that don't address the underlying issue. This could be substance abuse. This could be alcoholism. This could be addiction to work, food addictions, anything that a male may do to cope with their emotional life that's not healthy, that gets in the way of typical functioning. Exercise is incredibly important. Mental health is directly correlated by moving our body. Our body was designed to move, and when we don't move, we get unhappy. And so when we move our body releases dopamine and serotonin, right? Which are two hormones which are really important to our mental health and to a positive outlook on the world. And men have a very robust need to move and to be physical and to do that in a productive way. Sleep, same thing. Your endocrine system, the system that releases stress hormones, but also that releases healthy hormones like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, is directly affected by sleep. And if you don't get enough sleep, your body's going to be dysregulated. You're going to be releasing more stress hormones than positive hormones. And so it's very important for men to get adequate sleep, not to be tough and to stay up all night working on something, but to say, I need to sleep so that I can be well-centered and focused tomorrow. It's important to talk. And I'm going to say this over and over and over again. It's important for men to find someone to talk to, a therapist, a friend, a family member, and to practice talking about their emotions, because we do not have that. And finally, it's important for men to be with people. Spending time with real people is the number one factor in mental health and resilience. If you do not have people who you feel support you and who love you, you are going to struggle with your mental health and your overall resilience. And men have a tendency to isolate when they get upset and emotional. And unfortunately, that is the exact wrong thing to do. It's very important for men to find other men that they can get together with and who they can talk to, because we are herd animals. And as herd animals, we need to be together with others in order to feel safe and supported. So here at the end, what do we need to do as a society? So those are some things males can do. What do we need to do as a society? Well, there's a few things. There's a lot more, but I've kind of tailored this down to two. Number one, I think that employers need to accept and encourage using sick leave to address mental health issues. And I think men have to start to acknowledge that they need help with their mental health and talk about that. I've, again, started to do this here at work when I tell people I need to take a mental health day. I need to take a day where I can recenter and refocus myself. And by doing that, it normalizes that behavior and it allows others to think and to address their mental health. But we also need to discuss how other segments, women, right, LGBTQIA folks, other social groups can support men and be allies as men seek to redefine their place in 21st century society. Men are struggling, and I will be the first to acknowledge that, as a white middle class male, I'm part of the problem. And the privilege that I have is more of a weapon than a benefit. And I recognize that. And I need to change. And yet, in order to change and in order to understand that, it takes an emotional toll. It's important that people feel, that men feel like they're supported and that there are allies who they can rely on and who are there to cheer them on and to help them make those changes that are necessary. Like I say here, it can't be a blame-based adversarial relationship. It has to be based upon compassion, collaboration, and understanding. So here in the end, what we really need to do is define a new masculinity, because the model that we've had since the 1800s is not at all healthy, accurate, or sustainable. Most importantly, we need to engage in conversations with boys about what it means to be a man. And that means discussing issues like gender norms, violence, mental health, social pressures, expectations. And as we talk about those things, again, it gives boys the language that they need to manage the emotional life and the emotional toll that life will take on them. It's important that we catch boys before they're fully socialized. It's much, much harder as an adult, right? I didn't learn about this till I was in my 40s and was struggling with trying to catch up in my 40s. If we can catch boys when they're younger, before they're fully socialized, and help them start to gain these skills when they're at home or when they're in school, they will have a much, much better chance of being successful and managing their new role within the world that we live in, than waiting till it's too late. And part of that relies upon adult males. It requires adult males to stand up. It requires adult males to point out aspects of toxic masculinity, that machismo, that sort of suck it up, be tough attitude that a lot of us have observed, and point out that that's harmful and that's antiquated and that we need to move on and not rely upon those harmful stereotypes. Like I say here, if we can't talk about it, then we can't exercise control over it. If we can talk about it, then we can actually do something about it. And finally, and I know I bring this up a lot, it's really, really important for fathers and adult males to model healthy behaviors and coping mechanisms. Males, more so than others, learn through observation and apprenticeship. They learn by seeing others do and then replicating what they've seen others do. This is so key to male learning. And if males don't see others doing things, they are less likely to model those things. And so it's so important that adult males recognize these issues, learn about them, and then start to model these healthy behaviors and language and coping mechanisms so that the younger generation will have those tools as they grow up. So with that said, I want to say thank you. I think I'm right at time. I appreciate you listening to me blabber on for a bit here. I hope it was useful. And I'll turn it back over to Janelle.
So, Matt, thank you so much for sharing those stories with you. I am presenting our case, and some of those things that you talked about is some of those things that the dad was sharing as he's going through this. And so I loved your insight of having the right language to do that. And even as I was thinking, I was processing, it was harder for me to have some of those difficult conversations with the dad than it was with the mom. So checking my things. I'm going to just open it up for a few minutes if anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Matt, for all of your in-depth revealing and processes that you've gone through. And the sharing with others, in here in our little intimate group, as well as at your work and through the state. I think is very profound, and I greatly appreciate it as we move ahead through such challenging times. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Okay, well, I know you need to get off, Matt. Oh,
I've got
Heather, you
one
have
more.
one.
I do. Matt,
right.
I have a question. This is kind of a combination question for me, both coming from my perspective as a professional slash parent. So for me, obviously it's forefront in my mind professionally about mental health, but and it's a topic that I've brought up many times with parents, you know, encouraging them when I've seen that need or felt that that's something that would be relevant for them, and that hesitation or that taboo that's there, that families feel or parents feel in their own prejudice or that familial influence that comes from generations and that kind of thing. But I've also experienced it myself, which then brings me kind of to that parent aspect, because my own son, who's now 14, has been struggling, and it's a subject that we've brought up with him. And while he has expressed that he has really struggled and had some difficulties with mental health and school, and he's wanted help, and we've brought up the idea of getting some additional help professionally, and suggested that as an option to him. His response was, I don't like to talk to people. Which I thought was really eloquent of him to really put out there his objection to seeking that help. But I really felt like, as you know, we're discussing that those elements of the taboos, or the way that we kind of culturally define the male role. He succinctly put out there, I don't like to talk to people, so that's why I don't really want to go talk to a mental health professional. So on the one hand, he wanted support and help, but he didn't really feel like that was something that he could access, or he didn't feel comfortable accessing it because of that very thing. So I kind of wanted to ask you, how is a way to help teens, or to help even adults, or anybody who wants that help, who wants that support, but they don't really feel like it's accessible to them because they're really kind of fighting that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. And to a certain extent, I struggled with the same thing with my son, who didn't want to talk about things. He grew up with me part of the time in my negative phase, I call it. So he absorbed a lot of those attitudes and attributes. And he eventually got to a point where he broke down. I remember it was at the beginning of COVID. We were in the car driving to Panda Express to get dinner, and he just broke down crying, which I'd never seen my son cry, because he just couldn't take it anymore. And although we talked to him about therapists and other things, he just didn't reach that point. And so sometimes you have to wait till somebody reaches a point where they're like, oh, I need help, right? They need to accept help. But part of it was also, we kept bringing it up. You know, I think a therapist might help you. I think this might, and just kind of keep that idea there. Sometimes it takes people a little bit to get used to that concept. But the other thing that we did was that we said, well, part of it, especially with young males, is you don't want to be out there on your own. We don't like to be alone, even though there's this stereotype about the independent, maverick male. Most males don't like to go out and do things alone, especially adolescent males. And so I said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you to the therapist, and we'll meet them, and we'll find somebody who will work with you. And we went to 3 or 4 therapists before we found one where he's like, yeah, I think I can talk to this person. And so it required us to be there and to be very supportive and to be constantly talking with him and encouraging him until he finally said, yes, I'm willing to do it. And we said, we'll be there. We'll support you. So it's not, the first time that you say that you suggest that, it's highly unlikely that kids are going to say, yes, I'm willing to go do that. Sometimes you have to wait till it reaches a crisis, but just make sure they know that you're there and that there are options and that they can talk to you. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's my experience.
That was great. Thanks. Are you okay for one more question? It looks like Maria has one.
Yep.
Well,
Maria.
I was just going to share with Heather about what she said. I'm a teacher, or I used to teach, and I had a student that she was struggling a lot with behavior, and she was bothering other kids. And she was the same way. She didn't want to talk about her problems or why she was acting the way she acting. So I gave her the option. I bought a new journal for her. I gave it to her and I said, if you ever want to share what's going on or, describe your day, and if you want me to do some feedback, let me know. And I just left a notebook on her desk and she started actually writing. I feel like the girls don't like me and the boys don't want to play with me. And then I was like, do you want to talk to me? Like I put a question, do you want to talk to me about it or do you want me to respond to it? And of course, she always said, I just want you to respond in writing. And then later she started actually coming and talking to me about the problem. So I was thinking, I don't know if you can do that with your son or find somebody that he doesn't have to talk, even like virtually, maybe just write something, it doesn't have to be a whole essay, or pages of writing, just a simple question, I feel lonely. And then you just answer like, why, how can I help you? And I don't know, that's just a thing that I use with my students and that it helped a lot those students that didn't want to talk to people about their problems.
Yeah. Journaling's a great way to do it. Yeah. Especially if somebody's very averse to talking. But it looks like Devin put a question in the box here that says, how did you navigate the process of finding a therapist who fit with your son time insurance cost? Like I said, therapists are unique and you have to find one that works for you. So to a certain extent, you have to shop around, right? So you have to go visit a few before you find one that kind of fits with your particular or my son's particular needs. So we went to 3 or 4 therapists before we found one where he's like, yes, I think I can work with this guy. And interestingly for my son, it was a guy he felt like he fit better with. And he was more willing to open up to. Now, going to the time insurance cost, we ended up finding a therapist who would meet on Sunday because my son was going to school and was busy during the week. So this was a therapist who would meet on Sunday. We would drive him down there on Sunday for the appointments and drop him off. The insurance thing, we had to navigate on our own. Although it would have been ideal to find a therapist who billed insurance, we were not able to do that. And so our therapist would bill us and then we would submit that paperwork to insurance and do all of the back and forth with the insurance. So we had to absorb some of that work, but it was worth it for a therapist who my son liked and got along with. I mean, I literally say that, this therapist that my son found saved his life. I have no doubt that he was heading down a very dark road. And so, we were willing to put that time and effort in. And I think when kids see that you're willing to put that time and effort in to support them, that also helps encourage them to continue working on these things. So anyway, but I need to run. I have a 1:00 presentation I got to do now. So.
Well, thank you once again, Matt,
Yep.
for sharing your story with us. That was amazing. And I wish that you would be around to listen to our case presentation because you would probably have some really nice insights.
I wish I would be too. I'm sorry I've got to run.
No.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see ya.
Hey.
Before we move on, here we
Uh-huh.
go.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to highlight that the Utah Association of Infant Mental Health we're having our annual meeting, our annual conference, February 2nd and 3rd, in the morning. It's a Zoom conference. The topics are to support the caregivers, mothers and parents, and also providers who are doing care. But again, it's kind of, I think it's ties together in terms of talking about the stress of taking care of and coping with it. Please, I put this to highlight on the chat, but take a look at it, because even though it's infant mental health, it's for everyone. Thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. And I do think that, if we think about things that it impacts the whole family, right? Nothing happens to a family without impacting the whole family. So thanks for sharing that. So today I'm presenting a case. I asked a dad that I work with if he would be willing to share his story with us and get some information. And he was thrilled to be able to share it. However, our time didn't work with his work schedule, so he gave me permission to share his story. This is a two-parent household. They have 3 children. Religion is critical to this family. Their religion is the LDS religion. One of the things that the dad has really had a hard time with, and I thought that Matt spoke to it really nicely, was he doesn't know, when we talk about it, he's not really quite sure how to process the emotions that he's having around what is going on with his son. And so his little son, they noticed that he wasn't making progress with his development. And then at 24 months, he received an autism diagnosis. And when that happened, Dad when we were talking about it, Dad said, I don't know how to have my own feelings towards this to be able to then support the rest of my family. And he, the mom does also struggle with some of her own mental health. And so Dad didn't feel like he could ever really have his own feelings for this, because he really felt like he needed to keep it together for his whole family. And we've talked about this diagnosis and different ways to help support Dad. And I shared that earlier when I was thinking about it. I had to really think about my own emotions when I was talking to Dad, because it wasn't as, I didn't know how to always navigate that conversation, especially when this dad broke down and cried in front of me. That was really hard for me to see that. So he is really struggling with, and would love some information about how to get some information or provide some support on how to process his feelings about the autism diagnosis. In fact, he shared that when the doctor shared, when they were receiving the autism diagnosis, he shared that the doctor only directed it to the mom. The dad wasn't even, he felt like he wasn't even included in part of that conversation. And so then the support groups or the information was always given for a mom's perspective. He has felt really sad about this diagnosis, as well as just unsure of what's going to happen with his child in this process. And he's has shared several times that he's not really sure how to support his family, not just his own immediate family, but his extended family, his own family, to try to navigate how to share this diagnosis or what will happen in the future with it. So he would really love some suggestions on if any of us know different support groups for dads. He would love to know how to have help him have better conversations with his own family about the diagnosis, and then how to always include him in visits when he's at work. So he does, between the two of us, we really try to work and navigate our schedules so that he is able to attend the sessions in our early intervention home sessions, but that's not always an option. And so he would love to know how can he be more included in those visits when he's at work. So we will go into breakout groups and then come back. Now I think we're all back. Okay, so we are I'm gonna call on the groups and give one idea. So Jennifer, I'll start with your guys' group. What's one
Okay.
idea you guys had?
That's hard for one, but I'll just try to share that, obviously there's alternate ways of using Zoom or telephone calls, being flexible on scheduling those appointments. And maybe it's even just pulling the dad in for 10 minutes on the beginning or the end to give a update or make sure that he feels like he's a part of the discussion.
No, that's a great idea. Rebecca, what about your group? One idea.
Probably unmute, sorry. So looking at knowing that knowledge is power. So the more he can understand for himself, be able to share that knowledge with his family or kind of just work with the emotions that he has. It was looking at like maybe even some case management, but then an idea that was brought up was like online resources, just because it sounds like it could be a little more neutral or a little more catered to men as well.
Great. And then JC.
Yeah, I'll keep going with the theme of online resources. I've got notes to send to Shayna about this. We've got about 10 points, but there is an LDS Autism Parent Support Group on Facebook, about 600 members strong. There's a couple of other resources for, Utah Parent Center and Centers for Independent Living and all of that. So yeah, Zoom opportunities, Reddit subreddits on this topic. So I'll give you that list, but really just the online connection. Also, though, I know it's 2 ideas, Janelle, but I'm going to sneak it in there. Just more connections outside of autism for himself, like what Matt was talking about, developing other opportunities to engage in his hobbies or things that are going to support his own mental well-being. It's going to create space for these other things to have a place to land and space in his head.
Great. Kurt, what about your group?
Yeah, we went totally off topic. We were supposed to come up with the resources and we talked more about how to get dads involved. And one of the things, a lot of times dads are looked at as fixers or the ones that want to fix the problem, but sometimes you don't even know what the problem is to know what you need to fix, quote unquote fix, right? And so there was I thought a lot of good suggestions, but one especially that, maybe whoever's there, if it's the mom or the caregiver, can record the last little bit of that interaction with the provider that says, okay, here's what we want you to do, here's what we're seeing, so that the dad can do it. Because if you bring home a report from a doctor and says, here's what the report is, it's hard to sit down and read, especially that medical stuff. But if you can just have that provider just say, here's the few things we want to do and get dad more involved in the rehabilitation part of it or the intervention part of it, that's a lot easier to do via video or voice recording, we thought.
Great. Those are wonderful ideas. So if each of the groups will email that to timetoact@usu.edu, we will compile all of those resources so any of the participants can go back and look at all of those. It will be on our Canvas page. Thank you all for joining today. Our next session will be February 21st. And we will be learning about the ACEs and counter ACEs. So thank you all. Enjoy a hopefully not blizzard weather.